series. I'm here from Earthwatch. James and I are here from Earthwatch, and we're going to be talking to you a little bit about some of the work that we do. I've been working on the water programme for the last year, and I've just recently joined the education team. So I'll hand over to James to introduce himself, and then I'll tell you a bit about Earthwatch.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Just quickly checking I'm not on mute, but I think you can hear me. I'm James. I work on the Naturehood project, which we'll be chatting about in a little while as one of our potential solutions to get you thinking. And yeah, it's really great to have you all here, and hopefully you'll find our session really helpful and interesting. So back to Kez.
Grand. So Earthwatch is an environmental charity with science at its heart. And what we seek to do is to drive the change that we need to live within our means and in balance with nature. And we do this by connecting people with the natural world, and also by monitoring the health of our natural resources and informing the actions that we're going to have the greatest impact. In the last 50 years, we've lost over half of our wildlife, and we have just as little as 12 years to limit the impacts of climate change. But we think we can tackle this problem, and we think we can do this through collective action. So we at Earthwatch are working to collect all the best minds together and get all the right people to work between science and engagement and make the changes needed to happen. So we engage businesses, we empower communities, we help to inform policy and management, and we also work with inspiring educators and scientists to work on the big problems. So we're focusing at Earthwatch on some key challenges where we think we can make the most difference. One of those is reducing pollution in water. Another is enhancing the health of our coasts. We also work on increasing sustainability of agricultural land and the management of agricultural land, and in creating thriving places in which to live and work.
Great, thanks, Kez. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the environmental challenges that Earthwatch tries to combat, but also so that we can think about these in our activity in a little bit. So just to start off, I think that it's worth recognizing that our environment is under more pressure than it ever has been. At the moment, we use about 25% more natural resources than our planet can replace. So it's like we're running up a debt because we're using more resources than the planet can be producing. And what it means for wildlife is that they're failing to cope. So habitats are really strongly impacted already, and that's only going to increase as we get into the effects of climate change as those start to increase. In the UK, we consume around 2 or 3 times our share of natural resources. So it is something that affects us and that we can make a difference by paying attention to. And that's also true for kind of threatened species. So although when they think about endangered animals, your mind might go to pandas or tigers, there are actually a lot of species that are threatened here in the UK. I mean, we've lost around 50% of our otters, badgers, owls, all those sorts of things. And then even people's favourite animals like hedgehogs are now classed as vulnerable to extinction in the UK. So this really threatens the future of our environment, but also it threatens the livelihoods of millions of people all around the globe. So it's an important thing to be thinking about. And so we need to find ways to live within our planetary limits and care for our world. Thinking about urban wildlife particularly, so habitat loss and degradation is kind of like the #1 challenge for urban wildlife. In the last 100 years, we've lost around 500,000 ponds and 95% of our wildflower meadows in the UK. And that's come through things like agriculture, logging, transport, mining, and then the impact of all those industries is the fragmentation of what's left. So fragmentation not only of land, but also of water resources. And it meant that in 2016, in the State of Nature report, which was the coming together of lots of different environmental charities and also researchers, academics, they described the UK as one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And so, yeah, when we think about losing wildlife and in urban areas as well as in the countryside, what that means is that we lose some of the benefits it has for us. So in urban areas, we have different challenges that wildlife really helps to deal with. I mean, one great example is pollination. So lots of the food we eat relies on insects pollinating the flowers of those plants, so they'll actually grow the fruit and the vegetables. So things like tomatoes, potatoes, loads of different things. And for those to be pollinated properly, we need to have healthy insect populations and also diverse insect populations, because not every insect pollinates every kind of plant. And so that's why it's really important for us to do what we can to support urban wildlife. Kez, do you want to chat a little bit about urban green space and also social inequality?
Absolutely, James. So we're all moving to the cities, basically. More and more people are living in cities as opposed to rural places, and they think that that's going to be about 68% of us living in cities by 2050, so quite soon. And as more people live in these cities, we've put more and more pressure on the resources that are available to us. These are quite small spaces that we've got a lot of things going on in. And that's what's great about living in cities as well. They bring a lot of benefits to us, but it puts a lot of pressure on the environment. And many of the challenges for living in cities are related to the climate crisis. So we've got things like the urban heat island effect, which is having all that concrete and all those people and all that traffic together in one space creates this kind of microclimate, a very, very warm area. And also things like increased flooding risk, all that concrete and changing the rivers from how they're meant to flow naturally for us to be able to fit around them means that we're at a high risk of flooding, which I'm sure in Oxford you've all had some experience of at some point. We've also got problems with water resource scarcity, so the exact opposite of that. The way that we're using our water resources means that we're running out of fresh water that's accessible to us. And also things like pollution. You've probably seen a lot of bits of plastic around the place, but there's also chemical pollution that goes into our water, air pollution, lots of different kinds of pollution that we create. And then the big one that James was just talking about is that biodiversity loss, that loss of the animals and the other species that we really care about, and the breaking up of their habitats, like the hedgehog habitats that we've been breaking up, which means they find it hard to get to different spaces because we've got roads and things in the way. Another big problem for our 21st century is this inequality. And there's this big disconnect between people and nature, particularly young children and young people from their natural environments. And that's really been growing in our modern day. And it's even been coined now, we call it the nature deficit disorder. And it has real life human costs. So people have diminished use of their own senses, problems with paying attention, and there are much higher rates of physical and emotional illnesses. And that's all happening because people aren't getting access to green spaces. And that's even more true for people with lower socioeconomic status or those from deprived areas. They get to visit outdoor spaces less. And that's because there's a lack of accessibility. People can't get to parks because they just don't exist in these cities where people are living. This is really impacting on environmental health and things like air quality and flooding. So people who are living in these areas have more problems with flooding, diminished air quality, because there's less green space around to start mitigating some of those problems. In 2017, there was a report that found that the environmental sector is the least diverse, the second least diverse in the UK. And further research identified that ethnic minorities are actually discouraged by this fact. So we're getting less people of different racial and ethnic diversities into the environmental movement because there isn't anyone there to start with. So that's a really big problem that we're facing in the environmental sector today. And that provides us with some key barriers to engaging with people and including people. So we've got a lack of opportunity and awareness because of those lack of experiences. So now we can go over to some solutions, because that's enough doom and gloom for the day.
Yeah.
So research suggests that people with a greater connection to nature are more likely to behave positively towards the environment, wildlife and habitats. So if we're able to connect people to their natural spaces, they actually have an emotional relationship to nature, and that can help us to mobilise communities. And this is going to be really, really critical for the future of wildlife conservation, for making people really care. Organisations, schools, charities and businesses all need to get involved. and provide a widespread and really inclusive, accessible opportunities so that everybody gets to participate in outdoor learning and getting outside in the environment. And it's really important that we provide these really safe and quality spaces for people to have outdoor learning opportunities that are tailored to local needs of that community, and to be able to, for us to equip the educators and the students to be able to have the relevant information so that they can understand what's happening with the environment and with climate change. The English Outdoor Council praises outdoor learning for its ability to raise educational standards and provide experiential learning, and for many young people. And this is going to be some people's first real experience with connecting with the natural world. And studies also demonstrate the impact of outdoor and environmental learning and how this can benefit not only people's professional and social development, but also increase their self-confidence and their personal achievements, and even get them better results in academic areas. So these experiences are increasingly important as we face climate change, and also with the onset of COVID, where people have been more and more locked into their local areas. So over to James to talk about some nature-based solutions for this.
Yeah, nature-based solutions is actually a bit of a technical term, but what's quite nice is it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's all about working with nature to address some of those challenges that Kez and I just talked about. And so not only can nature-based solutions kind of provide practical solutions, so if there's something like there's a flood risk and you've planted trees to try and address that risk, they also have amazing benefits that come alongside that. So it's great for people's well-being to have that little woodland area to go and experience. And it's also really good for supporting local biodiversity. So some of those species that you might find locally can suddenly have more habitat, and so it can really help provide for them. And so what we mean by doing nature-based solutions is it's all about protecting, restoring, or managing those semi-natural ecosystems based on the benefits that they can provide for us. So that might be managing an aquatic system, so managing rivers or lakes. It might be also kind of planting and creating new habitat. And it might also be working with places that are kind of working landscapes, so agricultural landscapes, or somewhere where there's a timber production going on. It's sort of saying, okay, well, we need to work with nature in these places instead of always just working against it. And then when we think about our towns and cities in particular, there's also a recognition that there are novel ecosystems that arise in those places, and sort of thinking about how we can use those ecosystems to provide the most benefits for people and for the most benefits for wildlife. And so there's the idea that nature-based solutions are always underpinned by thinking about biodiversity, but also thinking about engaging the local communities who live around and will use these spaces. So hopefully that's been quite helpful, but I think what might be quite nice is if we talk about as well how we can apply nature-based solutions and these equal opportunities. So we're going to talk about a couple of projects that Earthwatch delivers, and then what we're going to do is move into breakout rooms so that we can sort of do some brainstorming, and it'd be really good to hear your ideas and that kind of thing. So the first one I wanted to share is Naturehood. Now, Naturehood is the project that I work on most of the time, and it's all about putting the power into the hands of communities. And so what that means is enhancing the awareness and understanding of local species. So completing scientific surveys so we understand better what features are in people's private spaces, so gardens, balconies, allotments, and also what kind of species are benefiting from those features. And we collect that in a scientific way so we can use it to further our research and gain better understanding of what features work. We can make practical recommendations. But also because of the fact that if you add up all those private spaces, it actually adds up to a space that's 4 times larger than all of our national nature reserves combined, which is no mean feat. That's a really large area. But unlike the national nature reserves, there's no real management plan that says how those places are going to be managed to support wildlife. You know, the power is in the hands of those individuals. And so we want to give them the knowledge and the guidance so that they can make those places more valuable for wildlife, whilst also still delivering what they want from them. In practice, that means thinking about things like hedgehogs. Hedgehogs are absolutely wonderful. Absolutely love them. And a male hedgehog walks up to around 2 kilometers in a night. So if you think about that as a hedgehog who lives around Cheney School, wants to go to as many gardens as he can and cover around 2 kilometers, how many kind of fences he's going to have to kind of navigate his way around, or how many roads he's going to have to cross. It's a real challenge for him. And so by adding things like wildlife passageways so that he can travel between gardens without having to cross any roads or confront any vehicles, that's really helpful. And so it's thinking about having access to food, shelter, and water as those key 3 things that wildlife need from our spaces. And then Kez is going to talk about another project, which is tiny forests.
So tiny forests are another nature-based solution, or a way of fixing some of the problems that we find particularly in cities. And they're specially designed for use in these urban areas where we don't have a lot of space. So they can be grown over the area of just a really small area like a tennis court. And what a tiny forest is it's a very densely planted. So we plant over 600 trees in this small area, and they're all native trees that grow really, really fast. And this is really good for carbon capture. They'll capture all that carbon while they're growing up. It creates lots of habitat for local wildlife. They're actually good for what I was talking about earlier, how we get that sort of hotter areas in cities because of all the concrete. But tiny forests in other countries have already been shown that they reduce some of that temperature problem locally. So you get lower temperature, you also get better air quality in the area. It soaks up quite a lot of that excess water, so it's benefit for reducing floods. And it's really good for us too, for the people who get out and get to plant them. That's experiences they might not have had before. And it also gives them some access to nature, a place to go and sit and be quiet. There's some studies done that have shown how being around trees can actually really help calm you down and help your mental health. They call it tree bathing. So if you ever out and about, you can go and spend some time around some trees, and I promise you'll feel a little bit better. So tiny forests are a really good opportunity to bring all those benefits into the city and let people have that connection with nature. And because they're so fast growing, you can get to see them, and you've got a tiny forest quite near you, just behind the JR, which you're going to be able to go, and you're going to help us collect some data on it. So you're going to be scientists for us and help to collect some information about that forest so that we can understand how those effects are actually working, because a lot of this work has been done in other countries so far. Earthwatch, we've planted the first tiny forests in the UK. So we really want to know how they work over here with the different kinds of trees that we've got native in the UK. So that's really exciting. You get to be part of cutting edge new science as well. There are lots of actions that we can take to tackle these environmental challenges, these innovative new projects like Tiny Forests and Naturehood, and also more creative ideas around activism and education. And so now we're going to get you to go into breakout groups. We want you to think about one of these problems, so either access to green space and creating new urban green spaces, access to nature for people, or things we could do for our local urban wildlife. And you might not necessarily be able to plant a tiny forest in your right by where you are, but what other things could you maybe do? And it doesn't have to be huge, big projects. Maybe what smaller things could you do? Like creating an area with some wildflowers locally. Maybe you could talk to the council about trying to get some verges rewilded, so we make use of those kind of ignored spaces. And we want you to think about how can you practically make that happen? What's the solution that you want to make? Whether it be large or small, what's that kind of idea that you want to get people on board with? How are you going to get people on board? How are you going to include people? Are you going to make videos about what you've been doing? Are you going to use social media? Are you going to put up posters or do some artwork? Or maybe it's going to be an art-based project just about educating and informing people about some of the problems. So really use your creativity and think about how your school can be involved and how your school can really be the example for leading on this project. So we're going to break you out into groups of around 4 people. Hopefully that can all start happening in the chat. Keep an eye out in the chat for some details. And we want you to assign a person to feedback your ideas at the end. So you're going to have a couple of minutes. Someone's going to feedback the ideas from your group at the end. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, James? Anything I've missed?
No, we're going to give you, about 15 minutes to just talk in your groups about what your idea or initiative could be. And I'll give you a warning just before you're coming back, so you have a bit of time to choose who your spokesperson is going to be and that kind of thing.